Good afternoon, dear colleagues gathered here today. So as Vice-rector for Research of the University of Murcia, and on behalf of our rector, Dr. José Luján, I would like to express my most sincere gratitude to the organizing committee for inviting us to this seminar about vulnerabilities. I am very pleased to welcome our speakers, and especially to Dr. Alyson Cole, that will give the inaugural lecture entitled The Vulnerabilities of the Concept of Vulnerability. I am very proud to represent the University of Murcia, a teaching and research institution that is dedicated to finding solutions to big challenges and to preparing our students for leadership in a complex world. Right now, we join a European alliance of universities with a core mission to understand, improve, measure, and rebalance the well-being of individuals, our own community and society as a whole, based on our joint values: democratic, inclusive, diverse, research and challenge-based, inter- and transdisciplinarity, entrepreneurial and co-creational. This symposium is an excellent example of providing a tool for society to find an environment of real reflection and discussion about a very important concept and situations that affect to a very broad part of our society, and that in many situations it is hidden or invisible to us. I have been overviewing the program, and it is impressive, showing how among all the participants are covering many important aspects of vulnerability by means of lectures, exhibitions, and different roundtable discussions that I am very sure will come out with very deep reflections and will also point many solutions that will have a direct impact on our society as well. When talking about vulnerability, it is impossible not to mention the many situations we have encountered under the COVID-19 pandemic situation. And while we were dealing with that, we now had to face the horror of Russia's invasion of Ukraine with the tremendous humanitarian consequences it has. It is true that human nature is resilient by itself, but governmental organizations must pay close attention to all these situations. For our visitors, I am very pleased to welcome you to the city and the University of Murcia. Consider you are at home, even in this atypical situation, and I wish all of you every success. Good luck to all of you, and stay strong. Thank you very much.
Alyson Cole es catedrática de Ciencias Políticas, Estudios de Mujeres y Género, Estudios estadounidenses y Estudios Liberales en Queens College y el Graduate Center City University of New York. Su trabajo une la teoría política y la política cultural estadounidense, vinculando cuestiones centrales del pensamiento político, especialmente las formulaciones de justicia, la naturaleza de la vulnerabilidad, la precariedad y la subyugación y la posibilidad de resistencia, con un examen de las ideologías políticas, la retórica y la ley, con una formulación de políticas enfatizando el género, la sexualidad y la raza. Los libros de Cole incluyen The Cult of True Victimhood, From the War of Welfare to the War on Terror, Derangement and Liberalism, How Capitalism for Our Lives, sus libros han sido traducidos al francés, japonés, español, sueco y turco. Los artículos de Cole han aparecido en revistas como Science, American Studies, Theory and Events, Gender's World Organization, Critical Horizon, European Journal of Cultural Studies. Cole es coeditora de Political Journal of Political Science y de Filosofía Journal of Transcontinental Feminism. También es miembro de los consejos editoriales de Politics and Genders, Women Studies, Quarter International Journal of Criminology and Sociology. Bueno, Alyson Cole recibió el premio del presidente a la excelencia en la enseñanza en 2008, el premio de mentoría del Centro de Graduados en 2021, una beca de residente de Mellon en el Centro de Humanidades 2019-2010 y se desempeñó como investigadora principal en Vulnerables, Formas Dinámicas de Vida, Red Internacional de Investigación, un colectivo de investigación interdisciplinario apoyado por fondos del Centro Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas. Bueno, Cole también fue nombrado miembro del colectivo de educadores activistas de la Alianza contra la Agresión Sexual de la Ciudad de Nueva York. Actualmente se desempeña como ejecutiva oficial del programa de doctorado y maestría en Ciencias Políticas en el Centro de Graduados de la Universidad de Nueva York. Bueno, gracias. Adelante.
Thank you very much. It's truly an honor to be here in Murcia and to have the opportunity to present this inaugural lecture for what I know will be a fascinating and rigorous discussion. I want to take a moment to express my sincere gratitude to the Town Hall of the City of Murcia, the Center for Documentation and Advanced Studies of Contemporary Art, the University of Murcia, and most especially Cristina Guirao. This entire Vulnerabilities project was her brainchild. She assembled the scholars, arranged for the translations, edited this special volume, and then organized this wonderful event. After gratitude comes a caveat. The methodology that I employ in my scholarship is to scrutinize language. I investigate how certain terms or idioms are being used in public discourse and how, through this use, the terms can take on lives of their own. When this happens, words become more than referential. They become invested with a great deal more meaning than what we find in the dictionary and are put to uses that structure feelings and ideologies. Focusing on language, on what can or cannot be said, and in turn on what is not heard because it is not articulated in a legible way, provides insights into what I call the grammar of politics. However, magnifying the political work performed by certain key words makes translation, which is always already an exercise in similitude and approximation, especially challenging, since words express culturally embedded meanings that are never entirely translatable. Still, I found that when I travel abroad to discuss my work with others, we are able to find deep resonances across idiomatic differences. And I sincerely hope that will be the case today, that together we can overcome monolingualism. I want to begin by sharing a confession. I'm rather ambivalent about much of the scholarship on vulnerability. I've come to think that my ambivalence is appropriate since the work that concerns me most seeks to emphasize the ambivalence of vulnerability itself. For many years, I wrote about victimization, not vulnerability. Beyond wounded attachments to my own efforts to destigmatize and depathologize victimhood, I have deep hesitations about vulnerability as an alternative language to conceptualize injustice and to politicize its attendant injuries. Articulating these apprehensions was the point of the article that I wrote that was included in the Vulnerabilities anthology. In the years since I first published that essay, the literature on vulnerability has only grown, and so have my concerns. Today I'm going to begin by providing an overview of what I call vulnerability studies, what motivates it, why it proliferates, and what I find promising about the burgeoning interest in the topic of vulnerability. Then I will expand on my apprehensions, specifically on what I think current work gets wrong, or more often simply neglects. These concerns can be classified into three general but overlapping categories. First, I worry that the project of resignifying vulnerability by emphasizing its universality and by amplifying its generative capacity dilutes perceptions of inequality, mutes important differences among particular vulnerabilities, and muddles the critical distinction between those who are injurable and those who are already injured. Vulnerability scholars, moreover, have yet to elaborate how to move from acknowledging constitutive vulnerability to addressing concrete injustice. Second, vulnerability studies responds to and has been shaped by struggles within progressive politics over oppression, identity, and political agency, perhaps most especially debates over its so-called victim politics in the 1980s and 90s. This genealogy needs to be acknowledged and evaluated. I find especially troubling how prominent theorists define vulnerability in contrast to victimization, and in the process adopt neoliberal formulations of victims and victimhood. Finally, I'm concerned about the politics of vulnerability. The issues here are not simply matters of utility or programs for implementation, but how current theorizing of vulnerability tends to occlude what should instead be foregrounded, namely the nature of politics and the question of how to support the more than ordinarily vulnerable. The flourishing of scholarly interest in vulnerability began in the early 2000s and can be attributed to a variety of factors. From 9/11 and the subsequent wars waged by the United States that inspired Judith Butler's pioneering work on precarity, to changing labor relations and rapidly increasing economic volatility under reconfigured market capitalism, leading some in Europe to designate a new class formation of the precariat. In recent years, the literature has enlarged exponentially. Increasing evidence of the destructive impact of climate change, as well as a global pandemic, have given the topic of vulnerability broad resonance and a new urgency. It's not surprising, therefore, that the concept of vulnerability has been doing a lot of heavy lifting, offering new ways to rethink enduring problems from marginality to inequality. For Erin Gilson, vulnerability is the gateway to empathy. For Judith Butler, to nonviolent interaffectivity. For Eva Kate, to another iteration of the ethic of care. And for Adriana Cavero, vulnerability provides a necessary alternative to masculinist rectitude, what she considers the more productive posture of inclination. In the works of Robert Goodwin, vulnerability justifies a robust welfare state. In Martha Feynman's, it enables governmental and legal responsiveness. In Kelly Oliver's, it expands collective responsibility, while in Zeynep Gebedi's, it is the key to protest. Conversely, in the respective works of Axel Honneth, Joel Anderson, and Katerina McKenzie, vulnerability helps clarify the relational component of individual autonomy, what Sarah Rushing characterizes as, quote, humility-informed relational autonomy. As is evident in the examples above, and there are many more, the concept is elastic and seemingly multi-purpose. Vulnerability is conceived of as a condition of life, both human and non-human. It refers to the corporeal, material, emotional, affective, and psychological. It is both universal and particular, constant, and yet temporally and contextually varied. The term also readily accepts a variety of adjectival modifiers. Accordingly, scholars have theorized social vulnerability, ontological vulnerability, inherent situational and pathogenic vulnerability, racial vulnerability, economic vulnerability, epistemic vulnerability, existential vulnerability, and moral vulnerability. Such multivalence is not evident in common parlance, however, where vulnerability is almost exclusively associated with violence and disasters, poverty, breaches of security data, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. Vulnerability is the lingua franca of global and international justice, animal and environmental studies, and the foundational concept for research ethics. In all these uses, vulnerability denotes a range of negative conditions, disabling qualities, and diminished capacities, including underdevelopment, poverty, conspiracy, violation, injury, harm, weakness, and helplessness. In short, vulnerability is thought of as a condition best averted, but otherwise a problem to be solved through various forms of securitization. The one positive spin on vulnerability discernible in popular discourse comes courtesy of the business world. Breen Brown has built her career by sharing how she learned to, quote, lean into the discomfort of vulnerability. According to Forbes magazine, her book, Daring Greatly, was one of the top 10 business books a decade ago. And her TED Talk, entitled The Power of Vulnerability, still ranks among the 10 most viewed TED Talks globally. As her titles make clear, Brown markets vulnerability as the key to entrepreneurship, as about risk-taking and perseverance. Vulnerability, it turns out, might just be the spirit of capitalism. Although they seek to complicate conventional understandings of vulnerability, Brown's advocacy of entrepreneurial vulnerability is not the sort of transvaluation scholars envision. They aim instead to unfetter vulnerability from violence and injury in order to identify the more subtle and mundane ways in which we all are inevitably susceptible to one another. Erin Gilson, for example, proposes a more expansive definition of vulnerability as, quote, a condition of openness to being affected and affecting in turn. Or in Adriana Cavero's formulation, an openness to wounding and caring. They, like Anne Murphy, seek to embrace the, quote, ambivalent potentiality of vulnerability. These scholars ask us to reconceive of vulnerability as a condition that not only limits us, but one that can enable us as well. Broadly speaking, the literature endeavors to normalize vulnerability as a shared, constitutive, and connective feature of our existence that encompasses not merely susceptibility to harm, but also receptivity to positive forms of intersubjectivity. To achieve this reconceptualization, scholars differentiate vulnerability from other conditions with which it is regularly conflated, such as oppression and helplessness. Incidents of injury or dependency are episodic and context-dependent, whereas vulnerability is a constant feature of all forms of life. Such thoughtful calibration of the valiances of vulnerability is an important corrective to our more common and reductively negative understanding. Since vulnerability can be mitigated but never eradicated, the quest for invulnerability is quite simply futile. Moreover, prophylactic gestures to stave off vulnerability too often reproduce violence. In the attempt to protect ourselves from being vulnerable, we establish security measures that lock away those deemed unsafe, criminals, terrorists, race and ethnicized populations, and lock ourselves in. The COVID pandemic brought the fiction of invulnerability into stark relief. On the one hand, the virus served as a great equalizer, indiscriminately ensnaring us all and disrupting everybody's lives in profound ways. The threat of the coronavirus certainly amplified the sense of vulnerability across demographics and across the globe. On the other hand, the pandemic exacerbated long-standing inequalities, exposing distinct vulnerabilities of certain populations. Even if we were all feeling especially vulnerable, we were not all equally exposed to the pandemic's dangers. These inequities were a function of pervasive injustice, gross economic disparities, and racial discrimination that exposed already made vulnerable groups to the virus at much higher rates and with devastating consequences. Reflecting on the differences between the widespread feelings of vulnerability and the vulnerabilities endured by those our public policies have left behind leads me to the next section of my lecture. I will now shift from discussing the contributions of vulnerability studies to begin articulating some areas of concern. Let's start with the shared endeavor to invest vulnerability with new and positive meanings. Scholars want to convey that vulnerability is not primarily about suffering, nor is it merely a way of being susceptible to harm. Indeed, some even write the word with a dash, as I've done in my slide, splitting the vulner from the able to emphasize their point. While that effort is important, especially when it comes to challenging the destructive and futile quest for invulnerability, I think scholars overstate their case and don't fully consider the consequences of this endeavor. There's a long and venerable tradition in feminist theory of resignifying gendered and therefore devalued concepts and ways of being, for example, care. But resignifying vulnerability requires a somewhat different strategy. The fundamentally negative connotations associated with vulnerability cannot be simply inverted. At the risk of oversimplification, feminist project with care was to show how vital caring and care work are and to argue for more of it. While uncovering the enabling aspects of vulnerability is valuable, the vulnerabilities that demand our urgent attention are those that deepen inequality and inflict harm. Emphasizing vulnerability as potentiality, moreover, obscures the temporal distinction between a general susceptibility to harm and the actual injuries that specific individuals and communities already endure. The designation of vulnerability shifts our focus from actuality to potentiality, from the already injured to the injurable. In grappling with prospective harm, we run the risk of eliding entrenched disparities of dominance and inequality that produce enduring negative vulnerabilities. Even as vulnerability scholars ask us to adopt a more expansive understanding of vulnerability, they also still preserve and frequently employ the more conventional and narrower use of the term vulnerable as a designation of harm and oppression. Such ambiguity is not incidental, but intrinsic to their project. Retaining the now double meaning of the term, scholars insist on basic, inescapable principles shared by all permutations of vulnerability. They semantically resituate vulnerability as harm in a significantly richer range of human interactivity, thereby naturalizing its presence and disarming the potential threat that intensifies social divisions and propels the pursuit of invulnerability. However, upholding vulnerability as harm and the more inclusive vulnerability as interconnectivity under a single designation exacerbates the chance of conflating the two. Such linguistic slippage, which the literature actually encourages, becomes ever more problematic when scholars accentuate the positive generative dimensions of our openness to others. In this way, resignifying vulnerability could unintentionally muddle and occlude its negative effects, rendering the concept incapable of accounting for asymmetries of power and asymmetries of legitimacy. Vulnerability has become such a free-floating trope that anyone can adopt it and hunker down in their vulnerable feelings. This leaves us unable to differentiate, for example, the grievances of white supremacists who feel vulnerable because of their increasing minoritization from claims of injustice by those systematically marginalized and oppressed. In this way, vulnerability discourse fuels what Lauren Ballant calls trauma's seduction of politics, whereby dynamics of dominance and inequality shift from the material and ideological towards questions of feelings. In the United States right now, the culture wars are raging again about anti-racist school curricula, among other things. Those pushing restrictive legislation against what they mistakenly call critical race theory use the language of vulnerability to justify their actions. The premise of these new policies is that school-age children are too vulnerable to learn what's called divisive concepts about history and politics. As legislation in the state of Indiana, for example, explains, quote, "No individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, responsibility, or any form of psychological distress on account of the individual's sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, national origin, or political affiliation." To be clear, these punitive laws are being established not to shield underrepresented minorities, but to protect white children who, after learning about the history of discrimination in the United States, might feel ashamed about their place in the hierarchies that still structure American society. So this brings me to the next area of concern: where are the victims? While I've pointed to various political, economic, and environmental factors that spurred the interest in theorizing vulnerability, current work is also a response to previous decades of debates over the politics of suffering. This genealogy, the process by which we moved from talking victim and other similar terms from the vocabulary of injustice to rethinking vulnerability, needs to be addressed for its theoretically and politically significant. Identity politics of the 1980s and 90s, with its focus on recognition, produced problematically fixed juridical subjects of the sort Wendy Brown condemned, and a potentially divisive multiculturalism of the sort Nancy Fraser criticized for replacing discussions of need. Many on the left came to accept Brown's insight that rights were being confused with equality and legal recognition with emancipation. Wary of aiding neoliberal governmentality, we turned away from the state. As we all became, if only rhetorically and only temporarily, post-identitarian, we lost a language to articulate claims of injustice. From this perspective, the work on vulnerability offers a fresh approach to tackle inequality more thoroughly than post hoc restrictive juridical doctrines. By designating a condition rather than a status or an identity, vulnerability allows for fluid permutations of degree and context, emphasizing changing temporalities and enduring interdependence. Accentuating the universality of vulnerability allows theorizing to move from the individual to the social, economic, political, and other institutional structures that support and undermine resilience. In contrast to the liberal constructions of the subject, the vulnerable subject is embodied and embedded in socio-material context. As a heuristic, vulnerability appears to circumvent many of the shortcomings of previous efforts to politicize injury and suffering. We might assume that conceiving of vulnerability as a spectrum encompassing the entire range of harms and benefits would include all forms of damage and all designations of injury. Remarkably, however, vulnerability theorists single out one term for exclusion, namely victimization. In fact, they typically conceptualize vulnerability in contradistinction to victimization. With surprising consistency, a negative representation of victimhood is a common theme in the literature. To give just two quick examples, a premise of Feynman's account of the vulnerable subject is to disassociate vulnerability from, quote, victimhood, deprivation, dependency, and pathology, as if these were all synonyms. Butler's disavowal is even sharper. While she interchangeably employs a variety of terms to signify those subjected to violence, such as precarity, injurability, and vulnerability, victim appears in her text only to denote and discredit the politically paranoid state. Why might scholars committed to destigmatizing the most vulnerable cast victims in this manner? It seems that the ostensible absence of agency or any generative qualities make these theorists uncomfortable. As Feynman and Greer write, quote, this vulnerable self is not a victim. She can act both individually and collectively. The opposition of passive victims versus active vulnerable subjects relies on a construction of agency and victimhood as an either-or proposition, abstracted from the social and political contexts that generate victimization, and ignores the discursive constraints on the meanings of these concepts. This impulse to uncover agency is not unlike the desire for invulnerability. Both positions ultimately disavow weakness and inaction as shameful. The active-passive binary, moreover, reiterates and reinforces precisely the conceptions of sovereignty and choice that vulnerability scholars supposedly seek to destabilize. Victims do not lack agency in all circumstances. They can resist, rebel, and retaliate. but they are not the primary actors in the context of their victimization. As I've argued at length before, the coupling of victimhood with passivity, dependency, and pathology is a product of a concerted campaign that took a discursive form and effectively shamed victims into silence. Regardless of political affiliation, victim became, and unprecedentedly so, a term of disdain in the United States, an epithet deployed to condemn the character of sufferers irrespective of their condition. Since the turn of the 1990s, the anti-victim discourse has become a crucial tactic in undermining progressive politics and dismantling the welfare state, providing the conceptual apparatus for the entrenchment of neoliberalism. Whatever promise vulnerability as a heuristic might offer is ultimately undermined by this reflexive acceptance of anti-victim discourse. Victimization should be addressed without recourse to matters of innocence, character, or agency. And we must question and resist the impulse to delete the term victim from our political vocabulary. Instead, I think we should reclaim it and redeploy it. Progressive politics needs it. This leads me to the question of politics. Butler asserts that vulnerability is inseparable from, quote, that dimension of politics that addresses the organization and protection of bodily needs. True enough. But what are the politics of vulnerability? What sort of political claim does vulnerability enunciate? Can vulnerability articulate what Rancière describes as the naming of the wrong? This concern encompasses two sets of issues. The first is the relationship between ethics and politics. Second, the process through which the most vulnerable become political subjects. For some, the theoretical move to foreground ontological vulnerability signals the displacement of politics by ethics. Critics of the so-called ethical turn, such as Honig, Rancière, Mouffe, and Meister, tend to reify the political. Nevertheless, apprehensions about how ethical thinking can obscure the fundamental dynamics of politics, such as struggle and conflict, as well as the way in which power delimits what ethics can be realized or even perceived, requires consideration. After all, even if ethics can help us identify questions of justice, determining the line between misfortune and injustice, or the suffering we must resign ourselves to, and that which we must fight to change, is an inherently political question, as Judith Shklar powerfully argued. The scholarship as a whole seems more invested in presenting vulnerability as foremost universal, at a great distance from questions of power and politics. Scholars presume that if we understood vulnerability rightly, that is, as a spectrum on which we all occupy different places at different times, then we would accept vulnerability as inevitable and neither something to fear nor to stigmatize in others. Corinne Modassani, for instance, reasons that, quote, if we came to terms with the fact that we are all, by definition, characterized by vulnerability, then it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to hold it against people that they are vulnerable. Is such optimism merited? Do we disparage the vulnerable because of a failure to recognize our shared condition and the potentialities it enables? Or is it instead that our impulse to discipline the most vulnerable derives from a more substantial and complex investment in systems of power and material benefits? This was William Ryan's conclusion after examining the policies designed during the late 1960s to address urban poverty, crime, and violence in the United States. Rather than focus on the structural economic factors that produce and perpetuate vulnerability, Ryan observed that policymakers found fault instead with the behavior of vulnerable populations and designed policies to reform them. He provocatively called such contorted logic blaming the victim. He further demonstrated that it is precisely those who are especially concerned about vulnerable others who end up blaming them. Why might these empathic individuals attribute responsibility to the vulnerable for their condition? Ryan argued that they do so subconsciously in order to justify the current socioeconomic structures that privilege them as elites in a capitalist society. The obstacle, in other words, is material and psychological, not epistemological. Consider again the COVID-19 pandemic. Our shared experience of vulnerability has not generated collective solidarity or inspired substantial efforts to alter the political decisions that laid the groundwork for the disproportionate suffering and death of those our public policies left behind. Instead, the fight against the virus was swiftly privatized. We distanced ourselves emotionally from its victims as we distanced ourselves physically from one another. Rather than reflect on our common vulnerabilities and interdependencies, widespread feelings of vulnerability led to the erection of borders around local, national, and political communities. It also fomented a defensive posture towards others and deepened distrust of government, whether that took the form of survivalism, and who wasn't hoarding toilet paper back in April of 2020, or rejection of mask and vaccine mandates. As we have seen, the literature parses vulnerability in numerous ways, but tends to uphold a primary distinction between two forms of vulnerability, the ontological and the situational. We're encouraged to embrace our ontological vulnerability. It is the situational vulnerabilities that raise questions of what is to be done. Two categories of interventions have been proposed to address situational vulnerability: resilience and resistance. The idea of improving the resilience of the vulnerable is not terribly new. Resilience as a term and as a goal has been at the core of human rights organizations' missions for decades. Even when the immediate project entails recovery and rebuilding, developing the resilience of the vulnerable ultimately aims to be preventative. That is, to equip vulnerable populations in confronting impending harm. But much like the commodified resilience in the ad for nylon stockings in my slide, resilience narrowly focuses on helping the vulnerable to be better able to endure anticipated wear and tear. The problem with resilience as a response to situational vulnerability, in other words, is that it aims to fortify individuals, to weather the injustices of the system, to more easily adapt to inequities, and to cope with inequalities. Resilience thus partakes in a neoliberal sensibility. There are no public demands or collective action to enact change. Vulnerability becomes not a moment for recognition, restitution, or care, but instead an occasion to further hone various forms of self-management and self-optimization. So I'm not a fan of the resilience school, but there is another, I think, more promising approach. Some scholars, such as Zeynep Gambedi, argue that vulnerability can be mobilized as resistance. Resistance, unlike resilience, aims to push back against rather than bend with. The so-called naked Athena, the woman who sat unclothed in the middle of the street facing down an army of state police in riot gear, vividly illustrates the power of vulnerability marshaled in opposition to institutional violence. Athena sat alone in Oregon, but there are other examples of naked agency in Nigeria, the Ukraine, and Chile, where together women weaponize their vulnerability literally and figuratively, and they don't clothe their protest in maternalism either. This form of vulnerable resistance is a powerful, resounding no, an important step in dismantling hierarchies that disadvantage some for the benefit of others. But resistance only creates a rupture that calls attention to the normativity of violence and the violence of normativity? Can vulnerability also be mobilized in projects of remaking, redoing, or repair? I raise this as a genuine question, not just rhetorical question, since this is something that I'm still working through and I would be delighted for us to discuss together. In turning to repair, I'm not thinking about rehabilitation, restoration, or even reparations per se. Some things cannot be mended, reconciled, repaired, or healed, and some things should not be brought back to their original form. But a reparative approach would include the a priori that decay and brokenness is greater than the individual and could shift political insurgency from primarily a reactive posture towards the question of the responsibility to change. As currently theorized, vulnerability is trapped in the not yet. It is, therefore, unable to adequately grapple with the needs of the damaged, the injured, the exploited, and the oppressed, or with the question of political responsibility. Much like the highway sign in the slide, warning that vulnerability lies ahead, vulnerability designates only potentiality. Because of its determinedly perspective temporality, vulnerability lacks urgency and makes no immediate demand, even when it is rallied for the purpose of resistance. To put it differently, in its malleability and ambiguity, vulnerability still requires translation for politics in order to name the wrong. The project of vulnerability studies seems more an effort to attend to the epistemological ignorance of the privileged, theorizing vulnerability primarily from their point of view. It remains unclear what benefit accepting constitutive vulnerability offers the already disadvantaged. Furthermore, in order for the more than ordinarily vulnerable to constitute themselves as a political subject, they must move beyond articulations of vulnerability to identify the inequalities and asymmetries of power they presently endure. Doing so requires complaint. Complaint refers not only to what happened, but also raises the question of what is being done in response. Complaining is what victims do, as I've argued before. In Sarah Ahmed's recent formulation, complaint is, quote, a way of attending to inequalities and power relationships from the point of view of those who try to challenge them. Vulnerability cannot be deployed to complain. So in conclusion, scholars rightly distinguish vulnerability from weakness, expose the dangers and futility of the quest for invulnerability, and productively amplify the enabling aspects of vulnerability. Nevertheless, we must still ask whether the language of vulnerability can perform the political work that the condition of vulnerability requires. I worry that it cannot.
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation. I'm gonna ask my question in Spanish because I've been drinking some wine from Jumilla and during lunch, and I'm a little bit disturbed. I enjoyed very much your presentation, your lecture, and all the questions that you raised. My question is in relation to this category, which is the vulnerable. So the vulnerable group of people. So you quoted a number of sociologists and anthropologists, scholars of culture, and perhaps I missed a text that I'm gonna mention. Is the text by Professor Keith Guirao from Princeton University, Pen in the Political History, where he tries to establish the history of political alternance between the Republican and Democratic parties in the US with relation to their relation with the suffering of others. And this is a topic that has been treated also from different branches of medicine, which I know. And The problem, in my opinion, and this is the question that I'm posing, the question is, beyond the notion of vulnerability, is to know when we know about vulnerable groups, we are talking about genuine groups or pretended groups, and this is a political question, and perhaps the reasoning that you arrived to, the notion that the vulnerability concept is permeable to political notions is true, because the answer to the question of whether the vulnerable groups are real or fake or have a vested interest doesn't have an easy answer, or perhaps it does have an easy answer. That's very much the question.
Sorry, I turned it off. I'm not saying that there is no such thing as vulnerable groups. What I'm trying to think about is whether or not the project of taking vulnerability as a term and giving it new meanings, and trying to rework it so that that some of the tensions that you see even between Democrats and Republicans that happen through vulnerability are somehow diffused. I'm trying to think about the advantages and the limits of that project. So I'm not saying there is no such thing as vulnerable groups. In fact, if anything, I think what I'm worried about is, I agree, yes, we are all vulnerable. Yes, we are all interdependent, but I worry about, and yes, we do need some common language, but I also worry about when we emphasize that commonality, how it undermines the more urgent cases that require our attention. And I'm not familiar with the book that you mentioned, but I will certainly go and look it up.
Hello, Alyson. I loved your lecture. And as you said, the concept of vulnerability has many vulnerabilities. It was very interesting. You explained most of them, all of them. It's interesting to find a political project that has the names, all the violences that we all suffer in the different social structures, and this project perhaps was the project of Judith Butler, and when she speaks about vulnerability, and certainly I would like to see where is, and if you can insist on the fact that the vulnerability cannot be articulated as a political project. So if you could summarize it just a little bit, this idea, and also in what sense neoliberalism with this victimization is privatizing everyone's problems. I'm not sure if this is a question or just a reflection. Or an invitation to talk.
Okay, so if I understood you rightly, Cristina, and you're asking a question about why vulnerability can't be mobilized as a political project, why I'm saying that it has its limits, but then also what's my critique about people who are opposed to victims. Okay, so, and they're interconnected. So, I mean, I think that, So as I tried to explain, I mean, I think that vulnerability, what's lovely about vulnerability, what I find appealing about vulnerability is the way that it's trying to do so many different things at the same time. Right, that it allows for, it's just this incredibly elastic concept, right, that moves and appeared at a point in sort of, not that there's a singular intellectual trajectory, but a point in conversations among the left about how do we get out of our stuckness in, and is there a way for us to both recognize people's differences and uniquenesses, but on the other hand, sort of have some sense of our commonness? Is there a way to, to transcend the divisions of identity politics? Again, we're back there, but That's the moment, I think, when vulnerability is coming to the surface as a topic that's attracting lots of attention. And I came to vulnerability with a sense of anticipation and excitement, hoping that it would do it, but I feel that intellectually there's something so admirable about the project, but I just think it doesn't quite translate into the agonal aspects of politics. I just don't see, I don't know if this translates into Spanish, but if you go and you make a demand and you say, I'm vulnerable, it's not the same as saying, I've been cheated, I've been robbed, I've been abused. I mean, it just doesn't have the same sort of finitude. It does seem to me that it's something about its being always already ambivalent, and also about it's about potentiality. It's not about, right, when we say we're all vulnerable, it means that we're born dependent on people, we're all going to age, we're all going to, right? But it's not, there's something, and I haven't fully worked this through, but I really think it is about the temporality, about it being a perspective temporality, a potentiality, and that not being able to mobilize that politically. So I think, so again, going back to, Venus, the woman who was dubbed, Athena, I'm sorry. Right, I mean, this image, which I don't know if you see, it was all over in the States. This is, in Oregon, there was the Wall of Moms, and then there was this woman who just came and, was very Zen-like. She sat in this yoga position in front of an army of police in riot gear. This is vulnerability, right? Being mobilized, right? But it sort of stops there. She's able to stop the police. It's a no, but it doesn't sort of move us forward, or so I think. I mean, come back at me and tell me how I'm wrong. So that's one. In terms of, so this is a larger project of mine in thinking about victimhood, but especially in the States, and here I'm very cognizant about my work being very focused on the States. Even though we see a huge number of people wanting to claim victim status for themselves, for Donald Trump being a fine example, victim is sort of deployed as a term of derision. You don't want to be a victim, you want to be a survivor. And there's a way in which, and it's something, this is what my first book was about, right? That how was victim turned into a status to be despised, as opposed to evoke empathy, sympathy, even pity. But now calling someone a victim is basically saying that they're somehow despicable. Makes a judgment of their character, doesn't really take account of what they've gone through. And so what I find interesting in vulnerability is there's this point that they stop, right? And they're saying, and we're vulnerable, we're not victims. And it's precisely that sort of stoppage that worries me. And yeah, I'll stop talking.
Many thanks. I loved the lecture. I have a proposal, but then it continues with a question. There's a lecture by Quinteres where he speaks about sexuality as a diffuse group, or set, and I've found a similarity with your lecture, where you speak about vulnerability and how it cuts sexuality or gender. How vulnerable that the cross cuts through a foggy space. And the question has to do with Kim Perez lecture, where he said that sexuality was affected by women's gender. Sorry, but the sound is not great. And here's in this lecture about vulnerability, something similar happens. The vulnerability cross-cuts many concepts, and it's difficult to put it into. This difficulty to put it into a category. That means that that's a good place because it's a place that politics cannot control. So I think this very ambivalent area for the discourse is very interesting. It's the same for like queer politics. The same thing happens in the area of the performance. There's this ambivalent aspect to it, and it's complex when you move in the space of art. You have more permission, but there is no political change after that. And so the question would be whether you think that the problem of not being able to answer the question is due to the fact that vulnerability as a concept is very vague, is very foggy in all areas, and so politics doesn't really manage to name it or to control it.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there is a politics to the interest in vulnerability. I think there is a politics that's driving all of the primarily feminists who are theorizing about vulnerability, short of this reference to a book that I haven't heard of. And I think that it's it is explicitly committed to having this amorphic concept, right? So I think it's so I think that's part of the project. Can we have a way to talk about ourselves that does all of these things at the same time, right? That and it's not just. I mean, I also think there's something accurate about it, right? It is true that vulnerability is about an openness that can be productive and generative, but it's also about a susceptibility that can lead to harm. I think that's right. And we are always acting upon and being acted upon, right? There is that simultaneity and working in both directions. So yes, if I've understood you rightly, yes, I think it is about, it is purposefully and I think wonderfully fluid, but I still think there's a politics to it that motivates the interest in describing it, that motivates the scholarly investment in using it. And my concern is that it doesn't get us where we want to go. If we sort of, I mean, in many, many ways. So, for example, as one of the points that I made, I don't think, I mean, there's a great investment in this idea that we need, the term that Erin Gilson uses is epistemic vulnerability. That we need to be more open intellectually and think about different kinds of knowers. This also comes off of the branch of theorizing about epistemic injustice. And the idea is that, so the notion is, as I talked about in my talk, that we don't understand vulnerability. We fear it. We try to protect ourselves from it. We think it's a condition to be avoided. So if we understood certain a prioris, we're all vulnerable, it's inevitable, we're never going to be invulnerable, right? Then that gives us the opening to feel more connected, to do some of the generative and productive things with it. But also they think it means that the people who are especially vulnerable, or as one theorist uses the terms, more than ordinarily vulnerable, that then we will stop feeling threatened by them. We won't be fearful of confronting vulnerability. It will help motivate us to be responsive and responsible. I'm not sure that's right. I mean, I like the deal of it, but I actually don't know. So this is why I refer to William Ryan, and I don't expect any of you to know who he is. He's a sociologist from long ago. But he found, and there's a psychologist called Melvin Lerner who has this belief in the just world thesis, which is a sort of similar kind of work and actually brings into the lab Ryan's sociological work. And he finds that people who are actually most empathic towards the vulnerable or victims are more likely to, in fact, blame them. That is not the case. So the problem is not that we can't identify, that we're frightened of it. It's actually that to really address the situations that create sort of widespread systemic vulnerability, I'm not talking about episodic, it would require changing a system that we actually benefit from. And so I love the project. I think it's really important. I've spent a lot of time on it and I am continuing to work on it. But I also think there's a point at which it's sort of misunderstanding the way politics works, but also what what's missing. So I don't think it's that we don't understand on some level that we're all vulnerable. I think it's material and psychological as opposed to epistemic. I hope I answered your question.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.